Good morning, children. Welcome to our English class. Today we will be starting our 13th lesson of Standard 5, that's The Adventures of Gulliver. As we have already finished the reading work, today I'll be explaining you a lesson. I want you all to please take your textbooks out so that you can be with me as I'm explaining. Okay. Gulliver's Travel is an interesting book written by a well-known English writer. The name of the writer is Jonathan Swift. Who is that, children? Jonathan Swift is the writer of this lesson. Okay. In which lesson he describes the voyages of Gulliver to various lands like Lilliput and Brobdingnag. Now, what does this voyage mean? Voyage is a long journey, especially by ship. So, he has written a story of Gulliver's travel, which describes the voyages of Gulliver to various places. And the places which are mentioned over here in the textbook are Lilliput and Brobdingnag. Though the character of Gulliver and these strange sounding lands are imaginary, Gulliver's experiences and adventures are written so well that they seemed real and true to life. Yes, this is an imaginary story which is written by Jonathan Swift. But he wrote it in such a way that it made very interesting. The story seemed to be real. So, Gulliver's story. Gulliver, the story tells that he worked as a surgeon on ship. So Gulliver is a character who worked as a surgeon. Now what does this surgeon mean? Surgeon means a doctor who is specially trained to perform medical operations. So he was a surgeon on ship. Who was a surgeon, children? Gulliver. As such, he made several voyages. As I told you already, the meaning of voyages, it means that long journey. So Gulliver has made several voyages. He used to travel a lot. In May 1699, he sailed on the ship. So what was the name of the ship? The Antelope. On the return journey in November, a violent storm sank his ship and Gulliver swam to save his life. So there was a storm. So what does this violent mean, children? Violent means a sudden and a powerful rain. So that was there. There was a lot of heavy winds and the heavy rain was there, and the weather turned upside down. So because of that, the waves were high and low, and there were long tides. Because of that, there was a problem for the ship, and then the ship sank. But what did Gulliver do? Gulliver tried to swim and come out to the land. So he had no other option to save his life. He just had to swim. So he swam so much that he was totally exhausted and became very weak. So finally, he reached a strange land. So he found himself marooned on a strange land. Marooned means left in a place from which you cannot escape. So he cannot go anywhere from that place because one side there is a sea and the other side is land. There is no other way to go out from the place where he landed. Okay, children. So he was so tired that he had slept for long hours. How many hours did you think he slept? 9 long hours he was sleeping. So when he got up, it was bright daylight. So let's get into the story. This story has 5 parts. So the first part is Gulliver meets the Lilliputines. Now, So let's read the lesson. I tried to get up from the ground, but I could not move. I was lying on my back. Then I found that my arms and feet were held down to the ground with strings. My hair, which was long, was held down in the same way. Thousands of strings had been passed across my body so that I could not move any part of me, but could only lie there on my back, looking up at the sky. Here, when he opened his eyes, Gulliver saw himself lying on the ground, but he could not move. Why? Because he was all tied up with strings, thousands and thousands of strings. He was being tied up, and all his hair has been sealed to the ground, so that he could not move. But he could only just lie down on his back, and only thing is he can just look at the sky. He cannot move his head to the right or left, because when he moves his head, he hurts himself. So he was totally packed with the strings he was hooked to the ground. He was pinned up to the ground. So now he was in a very helpless situation, children. Now, in a little time, I felt something alive moving on my foot. Then it came over my body and up to my face. Turning my eyes down as much as I could, I saw a man. He was not half a foot high, but his dress, he seemed to be a soldier. Then there came 40 more, following the first. I was so much surprised that I gave a great cry. Then they all ran back in a great fear. And as I was told later, some of them were hurt in jumping down from my side onto the ground. So next, what happened, children? As Gulliver was lying on the floor, on the ground, he felt something was moving on his body. So what could it be? Then he was just trying to look down, and then he turned his eyes here and there, and he could saw some small tiny creatures moving on his foot. And all over the body, he could see tiny creatures moving. And those creatures were tiny men from the land of Lilliput. They were of a height of half a foot. Then around 40 more people came. They were all dressed up in a soldier's attire. As I said, attire means dress. So they were all soldiers of Lilliput, and they were all moving on his body, tying them up, tying the Gulliver up. And he was so much surprised that he had to cry out loudly, what is happening? What is happening? So when he cried, then they all ran back in fear. And later, when he got friendly, then that time he got to know that many people have got injured when they were jumping. Out of fear, those soldiers were jumping out of his body, and when they were jumping down, they got hurt when they were jumping down in the ground. So children, let's turn our page. So this is how is a picture. Okay, here. Let's go to the second part. Gulliver attempts to pull free. After pulling very hard, I got one arm up from the ground. I also raised my head. This gave me great pain, for many of the hairs were pulled out. I put out my hand to catch some of the little men, but they ran away before I could close my hand on them. Then I heard a noise and felt a pricking in my hand like that of the 1,000 needles. I found that they were shooting arrows at me. I was afraid for my eyes. I put my hand over my face. After this, I thought that the wisest thing to do was to lie quiet till night. I thought that Then, my hand being free, I could quickly set free the rest of my body. Now, here in this paragraph, children, here Gulliver tells about how his body was tied down to the ground, and he was also trying to raise his head. When he was trying to raise his head, he could not move his head, but he was only getting hurt. So when he was trying to raise his head, many of the hairs got pulled, and then he thought that he could not get up. Then after a while, he put out his hand to catch some of the little men, but they ran away. Quickly they ran away because they were in a fear, because they were all tiny, and this Gulliver was a very huge personality. As you see in the picture, when he was trying to catch hold of those people of Lilliputians, he could feel something pricking on his hand. Some tiny needles, thousands of tiny needles were pricking his hands. So those needles were the arrows which the soldiers were shooting at him. So he was very scared that it could hurt his eyes. So what he thought is that it's better and it's wise thing that he could lie quietly throughout the night, so that nobody can hurt him, nobody can harm him, so that he can be safe. So that's what he thought, and he was very quiet all night. And he also thought that once all the soldiers go to sleep, then he can slowly remove his hand. He can just he can just pull out his hands. Once he pulls out his hands, then he can also remove all the strings, and he can free himself from those strings. So soon a platform was raised, and an important looking man gave a long speech. So here in this picture you can see near the head there was a platform. So there an important person stood on the platform so that he can deliver some message to Gulliver. From their gestures, he guessed that he was trying to tell something to Gulliver, not to harm the people of Lilliputians. So he understood. Gestures over here means that movements of parts of the body to express an idea or meaning. So with the movements of their body, Gulliver understood that that important man who is on the platform is trying to say something to Gulliver, not to harm the people of Lilliputians, but to be careful. So he also replied with the same gestures, with the same actions, saying that I would remain quiet. So Gulliver said, don't worry. With his actions, he said he agreed to whatever they said. Then Gulliver told that I am very hungry, because he was very tired, and also he swam for long hours, and he did not eat anything for a long time. So he was very much hungry, and he told that to that important person who was on the platform. So the next slide, children, and this is the third section of this lesson, wherein Gulliver eats a giant meal. Here in this picture you can see that people of Lilliputians, all the soldiers with big carts of food for Gulliver they have arranged. So let's read and understand. At once 100 men climbed up on my body and marched up to my mouth, carrying food. The bread was as small as bullet, so I ate 2 or 3 loaves at a time, and cries of surprise rose from the Lilliputians that I should eat so quickly and so much. The Lilliputians were no longer afraid of me. They danced upon my body and ran to and fro. I could have caught at least 40 of them with my hands and thrown them down, but I remembered my promise to remain quiet. Indeed, I was surprised at their bravery, for I must have seemed the greatest giant in the world. So, children, here in this paragraph, we see a word called to and fro. What does this to and fro mean? To and fro means first in one direction and then in the opposite direction. It's a repeated number of times. So, going from one direction to the other direction for many times is called to and fro. So, children, here, how do they feed the food to the Gulliver? They are feeding bread to Gulliver. Bread was thrown into Gulliver's mouth, and the bread of the Lilliputians was very tiny, small as bullets. So at a time, he ate 3 loaves. So 2 to 3 loaves at a time he ate because the bread slices were too small. Okay, so they were surprised, and then Lilliputians were like shocked. What is this? My goodness, they are eating. He's eating so much and so quickly he's eating. So the Lilliputians were no longer afraid. They were little bit comfortable with Gulliver because he was getting friendly with Lilliputians. So I could have thought at least 40 of them with my. He could have at least caught 40 of them in his hands. But then he remembered, no, no, no. I have given a promise to them saying that I will remain quiet. So I will not hurt anyone. Yes, he and he was surprised with their bravery. So Gulliver was very much surprised. They became very brave, and he also seemed the greatest giant in the world because that were Lilliputians were very tiny and Gulliver was very huge. And so finally they got friendly with each other, and Gulliver had a giant meal of breads. They were throwing the loaves of bread into Gulliver's mouth. At a time, he was having 2 to 3 loaves of bread. Isn't it strange, children? Yes. Later, I was taken to the city where the king lived. A great cart was made by joining many carts. 900 men worked for 3 hours to put me on the cart, which was drawn by 1,500 of king's finest horses. The city was just half a mile away, but the journey took almost a full day. Later, after having a meal, then they had made a big cart, and there in that city there was a king who used to live in that great city. They made a big cart so that they can put Gulliver on that cart, and that cart, a big cart which was made by joining small 900 small carts, many carts were joined, and 900 men worked for 3 hours to put Gulliver on the cart. And how many do you think have drawn, how many horses do you think have drawn that cart, children? Around 1,500 king's finest horses. They had to draw that big cart which was made for Gulliver. And how much do you think the distance is from the place where Gulliver fell to the king's place? It was only half a mile. But because Gulliver was very huge, the journey took almost a full day. Isn't that a very long time, children? Yes. So this is what is about Gulliver's movement from one place to the other place. In our next video, let's understand how Gulliver's new home was. Where was he put? So let's move on to the next stanza paragraph of our lesson. The king came out to meet me. He came near and looked at me, but it was not thought safe for him to climb up on me. Next paragraph. So, before we move on to the next paragraph, let's understand this. So, the king came out to meet Gulliver, and he came near and he looked at Gulliver, but he thought it was not safe to go closer, so he just stayed far away. So let's move on to the next paragraph. At the place where the cart stopped, there was an old church. If you see in this picture, there is a picture of an old church. So this is the place where Gulliver was kept. It was the largest building in the whole country. For certain reasons, it had not been used as a church for many years. It had now been ready for me to use as my house. The great door on the north was 4 feet high and 2 feet wide, so I could go into it by going down on my hand. On my feet, one of my feet was set in a great ring on the end of my strong strings, so that I could not get away but could only walk some distance outside door. The country outside looked like a garden. Here Gulliver explains as to how he has been put in the house. What was his house, children? Where was it he put up? He has been kept in the old church, which was not used for a long time due to some reasons. So the door was on the north. And how much was the height of that? It was 4 feet high and 2 feet wide. So the measurements also have been given. So he could go into it by going down on his hand. So children, he had to put his hand down, and then he had to go. So whenever he want to walk, he was unable to walk for a long time because one of his leg also has been tied up, so he could not get away from there. They have literally did not made him completely free. He was still tied up so that he cannot run away or he cannot escape from that place. But when he took a walk for a while outside, then he saw that that country outside looked like a garden. After some days, the king and his people were convinced that I would not harm them. So after I agreed to keep certain orders of the king, I was allowed to move around. So here the word convinced means to made to feel sure, means that was yes, I'm sure. That's what is the meaning of convinced. In this paragraph, children, the king was comfortable and he was convinced that yes, Gulliver will not harm any of the Lilliputians. So Gulliver also agreed to keep certain orders which king has given, and finally they allowed Gulliver to move around in the place. So when he was released, he was allowed to move around the place. He visits the city. That's our last part of this lesson. So as soon as I was set free, I asked if I might see the city. The king was pleased to let me do this. Orders were given to all the people to remain in their houses. I then stepped over the wall and went very carefully along the two largest streets. Here, in this, the Gulliver was set free and he was given permission to go and have a look at the city. So the king was very much pleased by the way Gulliver was moving around and orders were given to the people that they should remain in their homes, that they should not come out of the houses, so that they were a little bit afraid that Gulliver might harm them. So everyone was inside the house. All the windows were full of faces looking out at me, and large number of people were standing on the tops of the houses. So as Gulliver was moving out to have a look at the streets and look at the place, look at the land, then they all were inside. All the Lilliputians were inside, peeping out of the window. All the windows were filled with the faces of Lilliputians, and they were on the housetops to see the giant person Gulliver. Isn't that a very wonderful sight, children? Yes, as you see in the picture, that people, you could see the people peeping out of the windows to see how Gulliver looked. The king's house was just at the place where two great streets met. So there were two streets, and the king's house is close by to that streets. So there was a beautiful garden on all sides of the king's palace. So he lied down on the garden, and he put his eyes towards the windows. The rooms inside were very beautiful. In one room I saw the queen and some of the young princes. They were greatly pleased by my visit. So he was relaxed, and he was lying down on that one of the garden, and then he just turned his face and looked. Then he saw a room in which there was a window, and he could see beautiful princes, young looking princes. They were in that room, and they were all greatly pleased by the visit. So they were all happy, and they were all comfortable with Gulliver, that Gulliver would not harm him anymore. So this is the kind of friendly relationship which he tried to keep up with the Lilliputians, and Lilliputians were also very comfortable with Gulliver. So children, this is what we have for now, and I hope you understood the story of the adventures of Gulliver. So he was in a very toughest situation, and Lilliputians were very helpful in giving him food, and also they have been very cordial, and they have been very good with Gulliver and helped him out, gave food, and also allowed him to move around the city and to have a look at it. So this is what is the story about the adventures of Gulliver, children, and I hope you understood. See, this is what he was looking at. And children, let us also understand that we should also help one another, and at the same time we should be careful. Okay children, thank you so much for now. You have a nice day. Bye bye.